There was a period where death wasn't a taboo. People were around it, people saw it, people experienced it. And then we kind of got to this place where it became creepy, it became bizarre, and funeral homes were shut off and they became this kind of like dark, creepy place where all the dead bodies were. And funeral directors were kind of seen as like, lurch, and they're kind of just, wandering around in their black suits and looking all sallow. And it's no longer this creepy, taboo shadow world, and now it's something that's approachable. Nowadays, it's just a job that people do.
At 25 years old, Jake is nearly half the average age of a U.S. funeral home employee. Being a mortician, he spends his days in a service nearly all of us will need, but few of us know anything about. I'm Doug Frazier, and this is What We Do, where we'll meet the people behind the most intriguing passions, hobbies, and jobs around the world. Every year, there are upwards of 2.4 million funerals in the U.S. That's 6,575 every day, 274 per hour, and nearly 5 every minute of every day. For funeral home employees, death is more than just the big sleep. It's job security. If you can handle the demands of the industry. For those who quit, it's probably not for the reason you think.
Very few people get into it and leave because it's, too heavy for them or it's gruesome. Most people leave because they can't deal with the hours. The divorce rate among morticians is incredibly high. This is not a job, and this is not a career. It's a lifestyle. And your family has to be on board with it. You are going to miss every family gathering. You're going to miss holidays. You're going to work all of your days off. You are now in an industry that is unforgiving.
Jake flips through a set of old mortician's tools and picks up what looks like a large metal syringe.
This is a needle injector, and this one is not currently functioning. There are needles behind you that go into this. That's actually what you use to close the mouth on some cases. Rigor mortis can keep the jaw open, and no one wants to see their loved one with their mouth wide open, so sometimes closing the mouth requires things like that. Rigor mortis starts happening immediately after death, essentially, and it lasts for anywhere from 48 hours after death for the most part. And that's in a standard climate. If you refrigerate, it can change that. But yeah, it's rigidity in the muscles is really all it is. So when you get somebody who's about to be embalmed, the first thing you do is you bend the joints to get the joints flexible enough so you can get them into a peaceful looking position.
Being able to perform such a task takes a special kind of understanding of not only how to do it, but the significance behind it, which is
to make sure that by the time the family comes in, everything is as perfect as we can possibly get it.
I think people assume that being in this industry, it must kind of weigh heavily on you, kind of be taxing. But the thing is, people who are bothered by it or people who are taxed by that don't tend to last more than a month or so in that industry. Those of us who stick around, we're kind of a hardy bunch. We don't have the same stigma that other people do about it. We're not kept up at night by what we do because what we're doing is helping people. And we're helping families who have been through the worst loss that you can imagine. So for us, we're not seeing it as a morbid thing we're doing, we're seeing it as a service that we're providing for a community.
Studies estimate the first funerals took place 300,000 years ago, predating Homo sapiens. Though it's changed dramatically over the years, one thing remains the same. Funerals offer a time-tested way of mourning and closure for those suffering from the ultimate emotional catastrophe, the loss of a loved one. Working long-term in such a somber industry takes more than just a passion for helping people. You're gonna need a good sense of humor.
I think if you don't stay light about it, if you don't try to have a sense of humor about what you're doing, it does get a little heavy sometimes. If we have a service that goes late, that's a late night visitation or something like that, and the service is the next day, we have someone stay at the funeral home overnight because we don't leave anybody unattended. And friends of mine get so weird about that. Like, you sleep in a funeral home? Like, yeah, like aren't you worried about ghosts? If I was a ghost, last place I would haunt a funeral home. That's boring.
At Jake's home, he has a bookshelf lined with death-related oddities. It's part of a collection he's been growing for years.
I've been a collector of weird stuff since before I was actually working for a funeral home. It actually started out with books. I was really interested in old medical texts. Some of them are really weird, and they're just so factually incorrect nowadays. I mean, I have one up there that has a whole chapter on about, no matter what your illness is, It's probably caused because you were masturbating. There's like full drawn charts about, this is what this does to your body.
At eye level on the shelf, next to fragments of a human skull, there's a pig fetus in a jar filled with a clear liquid. It's known as a wet specimen, and oftentimes the liquid is formaldehyde. In this case, it's alcohol, and for that, Jake is grateful.
I have a friend of mine who collects wet specimens, and he just tried to give me a couple, and they're old, they're in formaldehyde. And I'm terrified of them, because if that gets knocked over, you've got a lot of problems on your hand. One of them was a foot in formaldehyde. And it's like, you have a lot of issues with this. First being that you now have formaldehyde everywhere, which is really poisonous and really caustic, and you don't really want to be around that. And secondly, like, you now have a foot that you got to deal with.
Oddly enough, he's had a lot of luck finding pieces for his collection at run-of-the-mill antique and thrift stores.
I mean, some of my embalming instruments came from a thrift store and an antique shop. They were something with dental instruments, and
They just didn't know?
They didn't know what they were.
Down the street in Norfolk, Virginia, sits one of the stores where Jake goes to find pieces for his collection.
This is Quixotic Arts. The main focus here is eclectic art, curiosities, and unique gifts.
That's Dana Cobb, the store's owner.
Everything in here kind of has a little bit of a twist to it.
Imagine you walk into an eclectic art store, but the theme is sort of a vintage Halloween meets modern goth. Crocheted artwork of skeletons, doll's head keychains. It's so eclectic that sometimes Dana isn't even sure what some of it is.
Jake actually came into the shop one day to show me some stuff that he had. I didn't know too much about the funeral industry, and he's like, I'm a mortician. And I'm like, what? So I was just pointing out everything funeral, death related I had, and he was like, oh, well, that's a so-and-so. Whenever I have something that I don't know what it is, that I think that Jake might know, I was like, hey, can you tell me what this is? And usually he knows what it is.
In the middle of the store sits a giant white porcelain slab. It lies flat on a stand, but as Jake twists a handle, the slab begins to tilt.
This is what people would call an old school embalming table. It is cast iron and enamel coated with porcelain, essentially, almost like an old bathtub. There are still some funeral homes that use them, but for the most part, everyone's using steel nowadays.
Stored underneath the slab are two glass cylinder tanks.
These are older ones, but they're still pretty much what we use today. They're essentially just pressurized pumps. You mix your fluids in there, get your pressure and your flow set. Those are the two knobs in the front, your pressure and your flow knobs. Then you can start injecting embalming fluid. Smaller oddities are nice because you put them on a shelf, but these weigh probably 50, 60 pounds, and they're just kind of just big, and I don't really know what I would do with it if I owned it. People do turn them into fish tanks, though.
Tucked in the back of the store is an antique organ. Jake takes a seat on a bench and sets his fingers on the keys. Their once white color doled from the hands of 100 years worth of musicians. Using his foot, he presses repeatedly on a pump that pushes air into the instrument.
I have been interested in music longer than I've been interested in almost anything else. I hesitate to call it a hobby because it's not really a hobby for me. It's just what I do when I'm not at work. I grew up in a house filled with instruments, and I started playing guitar when I was about 9 years old, and haven't had a dollar in my name since. I could be that guy, who's a musician and a mortician. I'm gonna write all my creepy funeral home songs, but that's not me. I'm not into niche music. I'm not writing these themed things. I'm in a band called Static Collector. It's me and 4 other people. I play guitar, keys, I sing.
They caught me running, and your father led the chase.
And I also occasionally play the Martineau.
It's a haunting sounding and looking instrument similar to a theremin, and Jake built it himself.
It is a very rare and early electronic instrument. It's similar to a theremin, but you touch it. It's like a small keyboard. In front of the keyboard, there's a ribbon or a piece of nylon line with a ring attached to it that moves left to right that controls pitch. The same way piano keys are laid out, lowest being on the left-hand side and highest pitch being on the right-hand side. And a pressure-sensitive key that controls all of the volume.
Scattered across a nearby desk are tools, instrument parts, and wires for electronics. Most of them are so small and intricate, you might mistake it for the workspace of a clockmaker.
I was an electrician for 6 years. And I was dating somebody who thought I should look into a more future-centered career. It essentially came down to one day I was just kind of being irritating. I was like, fine, I'll be a mortician. What do you think of that? And the more I thought of it, I was like, actually, this kind of sounds intriguing, and I kind of like the idea of this. My grandmother almost became a funeral director, and that was the only other person in my family who almost did that. And her family tried to talk her out of it. They're like, no, that's something weird. Like, you don't want to do that. Don't be a weird person. A lot of people who get into this think, oh, it's gonna be this cool, creepy job that I can have. It's really not any different than being in a hospital. The drone of machinery, the smell of antiseptic and sterilized surfaces.
Jake started his career in the death care industry at a removal service. If you've never heard of that before, you're not alone, and removal services prefer it that way.
A removal service is a third-party company that's hired by funeral homes and the state or the medical examiner's office, police departments, to go onto the scene and pick the body up from the immediate scene of death and transport it to either the funeral home that's handling the call or to the medical examiner's office for further investigation.
Jake's first removal was his step into the world where the living and dead come together face to face.
When I first started, before I'd ever been on any calls, I got really heavy anxiety about how I was going to deal with people who had shot themselves or really gruesome incidents, and also just how I was going to deal around being around a dead body. I did my first removal, and like I said, he was an 85-year-old man who had passed in the hospital room, and the family was still there, and the family were all ministers, all of them. All of his children were all ministers, and so they all had a very clear idea that he had gone on to something better, and this was just a shell, so there was really no grief in there. So it made it a lot easier, I think, to be around people who weren't, sobbing and like, clutching at a body. They were very composed, and it was much more of a factual thing, which I think helped.
Preparing the deceased for public viewing requires an artist's touch. As you can imagine, getting it just right can be tricky, especially in cases where photographs of the deceased aren't available.
It is so incredibly artistic. And even the littlest things, you have to keep in mind the color of the lighting and how that's going to change the tonality of the makeup.
Sometimes when people come in, they require some restoration work as far as their face. If there was a traumatic cause of death or cancer, that can cause deterioration of the skin cells and just general appearance of the face. That's part of the mortician's job, would be to go through and do reconstruction, which is normally done using wax and airbrush cosmetics and any kind of other cosmetics we can completely reconstruct. A lot of it's smoke and mirrors, but it helps out a lot for the families who want to see that level and that one last time, and we can make sure that they see them the way they should be seen. Photographs definitely help. We don't always have those, and the instances that we don't, it comes down to, that's what people go to school for, is learning the lines of the face and learning how to look at one half of the face and know what the other half looks like, because it's all math, and it's all, you can kind of figure it out by looking at it and measuring things out, but photographs definitely help.
With an open casket being such a close-up experience, there's plenty of scrutiny that comes with the work Jake does, especially from himself.
You're always going to be your own worst critic, and I'm sure I could think of 100 things where I wish I'd done things a little bit differently, or that I had taken a slightly different approach, but at the end of the day, it's not just me doing it, and I have so many backstops of coworkers and associates who are there as kind of a secondary set of eyes or third set of eyes to make sure that by the time the family comes in, everything is as perfect as we can possibly get it.
In our daily lives, life and death exert a constant force on each other. But walk through the doors of a funeral home and you'll feel that balance shift. It's in here, among the impeccably clean carpets and tranquil employees, that life and death seem to acknowledge the other's existence and call a truce. Personally, this is a recent revelation for me. In fact, just a year ago, I saw funerals simply as a tradition, a thing we do just because our parents did. Then my grandma died. She was the first person I'd been close to who passed away. I joined my brothers, their families, my parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and a dozen or so friends of hers I'd never met before. Packed into a small room with her lying in the open casket, a feeling rushed over me. It was in that moment I saw the invisible net we all cast into the world as we make a connection with each new person we meet. And one day, if we're lucky, some of those connections will become strong enough that they'll honor our life by showing up to our death.
You were always at the risk for just dying for any reason. People have been minding their own business and living their own lives, and it could all come to a crashing halt at any moment. And if you spend all your time thinking about that, you're going to drive yourself insane. There's no reason to let that rule your life. Let what you're experiencing rule your life. If you're looking at a headstone, there's the year the person's born, then a dash, and then the year that they died. The dash is everything they ever were, every person they ever met, everything they ever believed. The dash is the important part.
Hey, it's Doug. Thanks so much for listening. When you get a chance, would you mind leaving a rating and review for the show? It only takes a few seconds and is a huge help. There are a ton of fun episodes coming up, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any. To watch a video version of the series, head over to facebook.com/whatwedodocs. That's what we do, DOCS. Until next time, stay curious.
What We Do with Doug Frazier is distributed by WHRV for WHRO Public Media.